All right, hello everybody. My name is Noah Amrani, and today we are going to be talking about transitioning from legacy production in animation and different workflows on that end, going into the Unreal Engine. And just to give you a quick little background real quickly, I'm somebody that's coming from the animation industry and visual effects industry and been in it since 2009. I've primarily worked within character animation, visualization, for pre and post viz, and going into also compositing. I have a lot of a generalist background, and I've also been doing education since 2013. So a lot of background in that side of things in case any of you guys do end up having questions down the line. But today's course outline, again, is focused on just transitioning you guys from a certain workflow. As you can see, we are going to start with creating a new project in just a second here. I'll go over like the steps for that. Then we'll talk about some of the traditional workflows and how kind of that's been done with different digital content creators, or DCCs for short, and what the animation pipeline and story process has pretty much been like. We'll talk about the use of Unreal Engine today, also how the real-time pipeline has been being used, and we'll get back into working inside of a project file, just a starting up project file for a little bit, do some review of the interface layout. So all of you are up to speed and familiar with that. We'll do some basic starter content and what's provided within the Unreal Engine. We'll talk about those pieces. And then we'll talk about data management, kind of how data works within Unreal and how that differs a little bit from your typical programs like something like Maya. So we'll talk about file types, interface, and so on, how the project logic works, and then different tools that are used, or what transitioning from your typical film kind of setup would be, going into Unreal Engine. Then we'll continue to talk about what it's like bringing in just an animated asset, but just touch on that lightly. You're going to get more into a lot of that kind of stuff in your upcoming lectures. And then finally, I'll leave you guys off with some workflow best practices, and we'll open it up for lab. All right, so getting started creating a new project. So hopefully by now, all of you have opened up the launcher for the Epic Games Launcher, and you already have Unreal 5.2 installed. Yeah, to restate, so we will end up going into lab after finishing up with some work, some best work practices. And we're going to go into the Unreal Engine and start launching your first project in just a moment here. So hopefully by now, all of you guys have opened up the Unreal launcher and gotten that installed. And we're going to be using 5.2. So try to avoid using any preview versions or any new updated versions throughout the course. We're going to stick to 5.2 for the program. So the Epic Games Launcher will look like this if you're not as familiar with it yet. And you're pretty much going to just launch the latest one, that 5.2. If you end up needing to look for any items, as Brian has mentioned previously, there is the marketplace. You can search for specific assets or file types that you might need, or rigs. So you do have that option to look through the marketplace, search and download that to get that integrated into any of your project files. You'll see off on the right-hand side here, this is going to be the prompt that comes up by default when you first launch the Epic Launcher. And once you launch it, you'll see it'll show things like recent projects, games, film, video, and live events, architecture, and so on. So all that's going to show up. You can go into where it says film, video, live events, that section, and select a blank. We're just going to work with a blank file for now. And you can turn on things like the starter content and ray tracing to begin with. By default, there will be a project location that's going to be populated or created for you based off of your documents files. So wherever you have documents saved on your computer, that's where it should be saving it for your Unreal Engine projects. And you can make a new folder and navigate to that by clicking on the little folder icon if you need to make a subfolder, if you want to organize it that way. And then you can create a project name. In this case, in the screenshot that you see here, it's just listing it as Demo 1. Once you do that and click Create, you'll have a new project that's going to be built out. under the name Demo 1, and just let that launch in the background for now. We'll come back to this in a moment, but just let that load up in the meantime. Okay, so traditional workflows and digital content creators, or DCCs. So typically with your original type of workflow, traditional workflow, right, it's kind of represented in this waterfall production style. You start with your scripts, you start taking out storyboards and drawing them, and you go from your storyboard of animating or blocking out those main beats as a storyboard into modeling something, usually within a dedicated program for that. It could be something like Maya, ZBrush, and so on. And once you get any of your assets, characters modeled out, right, you get them rigged, you go into layout, you start roughing out everything in layout for how things are going to be animated and blocked out. Then you get into your animation, you do all the nice performance work that we're going to be focusing on throughout this. And then you get into dealing with mood and staging things through lighting, and then your final output of rendering out those images or that performance, and then getting into editorial, where that's going to cut in and ideally match everything throughout how your story beats were set up within storyboard. And then that's your final output at the very end, right? Any additional sound and so on. So it just kind of goes a little more linearly as you're going throughout that process. Now, traditional workflows within the CG animation pipeline, right? It's a large focus on the story development right up front from the very beginning. The publishing requirements are a little bit more restricted. A lot of that does have to do with whatever the editor is that you're working in, that DCC. So how things get saved out, a lot of times it's locked within certain specific DCCs. It doesn't always cross over depending on the type of files you're working with, especially if you're dealing with a specific workflow within a specific company. And then editorial and layout is the main production hub, right? So as you're going back and forth between editing and dealing with laying out your shots and trying to get the story blocked out, that's kind of where a lot of it is focused. And then there's a lot of built up work that's done once you start building up the characters, building up the animations, and it's all based in the original story at the very beginning. So it's less interactive, and revision process does become more laborious, right? Because everything is pretty much planned out from the beginning, and then you're just kind of building off of that later on. Doing iterations or changes, especially if you're rendering stuff out, can become very time-consuming and costly. And then we also have things like layered rendering output for compositing aspects, right? Trying to revise anything at the very, very end or make it a little bit nicer, plus it. And so, that's a great tool set to have and feature, but oftentimes that's used instead of re-rendering because that can take a lot of time, right? And then you have the limited cross-studio compatibility, again, going into some proprietary side of things and with the way some studios work. So that is what happens typically with the traditional workflow. And this is just kind of a overview here that you can see with what the typical studio pipeline looks like, right? You start with that story development and storyboards. You'll go into dealing with your modeling, rigging, and so on. That's the production design and asset creation side of it. So modeling, rigging, surfacing, scene assembly. At the same time, you're kind of going into editorial throughout the storyboards, and you've been creating an animatic or some kind of a story reel. And then you get into blocking. So once you have those assets made, you start doing that rough layout. You get everything going into final layout and refining your animation and the performance. Then once you have the performance locked in, you get into your shot enhancements, adding things like stereoscopic conversion or cameras, crowds, other additional character effects, effect simulations, doing matte painting work, and your final outputs within lighting, rendering, and comp. And then all that goes out to your final editorial that gets comprised with sound design and so on. So typical workflow that most of you are already familiar with. So the use of the Unreal Engine today. So the Unreal Engine is an open platform. It's extensible and customizable. So what that basically means is it has free public access to the entire source code and the way it's built up. It has a robust and extensive C++ API. So you're able to completely work within scripting for that. It has wide support for third-party extensions that you can download and install, and people can build out new, additional plugins and so on. It has a commitment to open source standards. It's future-proofed for accessing your data. And a lot of the stuff is intended so that as new versions are published, right, it will get carried over to the next engine updates. So you have that compatibility in the newer versions, and you're not losing stuff along the way. There's also Blueprint, which some of you may have heard of or may not be completely familiar with. And blueprints are a visual scripting system. So you basically don't have to worry about coding as much. You will, in time learn a little bit of that kind of stuff, but it's really meant to be an artist-friendly way to set up through a nodal-based kind of system to set up programming different types of behaviors or interactions and do it with a visual scripting sense instead of actually having to type code. So there's a lot of that that's supported and artist friendly. And then of course, if you do come from a scripting or code background, there is Python scripting that can be used for automated, repeatable actions within the program. So that's there too for you. So it's a comprehensive tool set, right? You have the ability to use this most open and advanced real-time 3D creation tool to be able to integrate your pipelines, however it's done within your own company, your own studio, or at home. You're able to do world building. You're able to do animation, which is our main focus, rendering, lighting, and doing creation of materials. You can do simulation and effects in it. There's gameplay interactivity, and there's a lot of platform support in where it's used. As integrated media support, and there's that developer tool set that we have access to. It's something that can be used across, again, multiple platforms like your phone, consoles, PC, AR, VR, and so on. And we were able to output things for still images, which is, again, part of that traditional aspect of outputting, doing things linearly, like streaming directly to a television set, doing virtual production on sets, interactive experiences, immersive experiences, and augmented reality experiences. Additionally, with Unreal Engine 5, there's a lot of new tech that's been added in that makes things a lot easier to work with and a lot nicer visually. Nanite, for example, is one side of virtualized geometry. So you're able to bring in film quality assets with billions of triangles into Unreal. You don't have to worry about restricting as much to the idea of polygon counting and normal maps. So you actually can start to bring in these high resolution models or assets, if you will, and be able to have automatic LODs or set up for you. So depending on the distance that you're looking at the object, Unreal is able to calculate the detail or the level of detail of that object in real time. So it's a really big improvement. Also, when it comes to lighting, we have a new feature called Lumen. So that's fully dynamic, real-time global illumination. And you're able to have light react within your different objects, your animated objects or characters in real time. You don't have to worry about dealing with light map baking as much anymore or authoring light map UVs. And so if you're familiar with dealing with lighting at all, you'll be familiar with what those things are, but we'll get more into lighting later on within the fellowship program. Virtual texture is another thing that's been added in, so you can have really high quality 8K cinematic assets. That's another big plus to get really nice quality looking assets and environments, as well as specialized audio for realistic 3D sound fields to increase your immersion into your projects. All right, so a little bit of the pipeline overview. Now, in this graph, just so you can see, there are a couple colors here. Basically, there's a little color key, but it says that If you look at the kind of teal color, right, that's going to be what is represented as the traditional DCC application that's applying some kind of a solution for each of those different parts within the pipeline. Anything that's purple is basically where Unreal is interacting or being used and involved within the pipeline. So it represents that aspect getting involved more. So there's a lot of similarities to the traditional pipeline. It looks a little more complicated, but there is a lot more interaction, a lot more revision process within the real-time setup, which is what's critical in that creation side of things. So you do start with going from your storyboard and story development. You do get into doing animatics and editorial work, but in that early stage of animatics and story reels, all that can start getting put right into Unreal and have that kind of interaction working with certain things, especially like Sequencer, which you'll learn more about today. And then production design, asset construction, even with rigging, you're able to start doing that kind of stuff within Unreal. Modeling, surfacing, and you can output as needed to go in and out between different DCCs. You also have assembly for scene assembly, starting to build up what that scene project looks like, and then blocking and doing rough layout. So while all this is being done, you can start capturing and building up your first version of previs on set, and then going into building up your first assembly of that within Sequencer. You then deal with world and shot definition, how that's going to be broken up for each of those. And then you can go back and export different assets or reference different assets within the engine and get into animating. And then from there, you have the option to bring in or export different assets or animations using FBX or Alembic and continue to build out your assembly into a second sequence for final layout. You then get into shot enhancements. So those typical things that you would, again, do for your typical workflow, like lighting, effects, simulations, and some of the post-process things that you might do like comp to a degree. You can do a lot of the post-process effects within the engine now. You don't have to rely as heavily on comp, but there are options for that where you can output still and still be able to work with comp. So you have shot enhancements within all these areas, and you can keep kind of going back and forth as needed to see how lighting's kind of looking, how assets are looking, all the way up until you need to render. And then you've got your final offline edit, again, added with whatever the editorial is that you want to use for sound design added in. And that's kind of like the newer workflow, but again, a lot more interaction with Unreal Engine. So real-time animation pipeline, you have the integrated story process, live action shot construction process. You can use Sequencer more as your production hub for editing and getting an edit. I was just restating, to restate, we're going from the integrated story process, going into the live action shot construction process, and you're able to start using Sequencer in Unreal as your production hub. So you can start doing a lot more of the kind of editing side of it and correctional side of it all within Unreal. And because of that, because of how interactive and everything is real time, you do have a more director-centric process where a director can jump in, whether it's in virtual production or whether it's after it's been done on set and things are being revised. A director can be more heavily involved with the creation process just because of how interactive everything is. So more interactive revision process. You get your final pixels out of Unreal. Of course, you can always alter them in some other program if you want to, but you can get pretty much everything that you want out of the program. And you have a nice unified pipeline to work with. So from there, we're going to continue into the editor in just a moment that you should have already started launching a blank project file in. And I just want to go over the layout so you can all become familiarized with what the layout looks like. And we'll just kind of go a little bit in there, and then we'll continue to talk about some of the changes and differences in transitioning over. So here you can see we have broken down different sections with numbers associated with it, so it can help kind of give you a little bit of an overview in where things are. We have the basic menu. That's wherever you're going to access anything specific for commands within the editor, things like file to save or to open or load different project files or levels and so on, to edit, to open up different panels within your windows. And we'll get into looking at that in a moment. You have your main toolbar. That's going to be down below, number 2. And so that does contain a lot of shortcuts for different tools that you're going to be using commonly within the engine, as well as being able to start seeing what things would look like in game in real time if you were to play that. I will, real quickly, I just want to mention, I do have twin toddlers, so from time to time you may hear some noises from them in the background, so apologies in advance if that does come across. All right, so this second bar, the main toolbar, it will give you access to selecting different modes and layouts within the Unreal Engine. We also have the level viewport, and that's going to be where you're seeing everything there, number 3. So all the content that's visible that you're interacting with, that's in the viewport there. It could be cameras, actors, things that are referred to as static meshes, and so on. At the bottom is the content drawer button, and that's where if you hit Control Spacebar or you click on it, you'll be able to see the different things that you have loaded into the program, different assets, actors, so on. So we'll look at that. The bottom toolbar, which contains shortcuts to like the command console, output log, things for scripting, and so on. And then your outliner off on the right-hand side. So that's number 6. And so that's going to show you, again, a tree view of things that are within your actual level. So that's just showing everything that's visible in the level itself, but not within necessarily the project file itself. And then below that, number 7 is the details panel. And this is where you'll see specific property details of a specific thing like that you have selected, like an actor, a mesh, any physical object that you want to, like physics settings or objects in there that you're working with. So that will show you all the properties and be able to modify it in there. And then for more, you have a link here, which is for more information about the overview or documentation on it. We'll also talk about some basics inside of your preferences. So you have, again, that selection mode, right? And so that lets you switch between the different workspaces. We have different ways that we can save and reset the layout. You can go into your editor preferences under Edit menu, and you can turn on certain things, which we'll talk briefly about, that can help make Unreal feel a little bit more familiar for navigation. You have options for changing your units. A big thing to be aware of with Unreal is that it is a Z-up axis program. What that means is the Z-axis points directly up. Other programs will use Y-up, such as in the program Maya. So anytime you're working between any programs, you want to keep in mind that there is a conversion that takes place with that. But also just working in the program, it's just good to be aware that your Z-axis, anything you animate on that, that's the up axis. Then there's keyboard shortcuts, which you can look at or customize. You can toggle between your different panel layouts, which we'll talk about, camera speed, and snap settings. So let's just jump into the engine now. Okay, so hopefully everybody is seeing my editor window here in Unreal Engine. So just a little bit of a reminder. Oh, heard something. Did I cut out for a second?
You're good.
Okay, we're all good. So at the top here, you have your basic menu, right? That's where I was saying you can create new levels, save out your scene, and so on. Edit to modify any properties, which we'll go into in just a sec. Window to adjust things like your layouts and so on. So if at any time, if you're dragging around panels, things get disorganized, or you like a certain layout, you can actually go under Window. You can save out your layouts and export them. You can also use default settings and restore them as needed. So that's something that you can find inside this window menu. Anytime things maybe get a little too disorienting if you've accidentally pulled panels away. But you can also switch between different layouts here in our selection mode dropdown that you see first. That's our first setting. Our first layout is just selection mode. but you can go between different settings for things like landscape, foliage, mesh paint, things for simulations and fracturing, brush editing, and of course, animation, where you guys have become more familiar. And back to selection. So that's just switching between those different layout options here. Okay, so before we get into more stuff in here, I do want to mention kind of a bit of the basic layout and the way things work within your controls. So typically when you're moving inside of Unreal, right, if you left click and drag, you will be able to kind of translate or dolly forward and back. Right click will give you this option to orbit or basically pan and tilt. And then middle mouse move is going to give you the option to boom up and down. Typically default settings for that kind of motion. But if you go into edit and go down to editor preferences, you have a whole bunch of different settings that you can access in here to kind of customize how the editor works for you. And some of those options are going to be things like keyboard shortcuts. Here, there's a bunch that are already set up. You can look through them and see what specific ones do which commands. But if you're trying to search for something, you can always do a search in the box here and be able to customize a control for whatever the needs are, especially if it's something you're trying to do often and it's not a keyboard shortcut that's already assigned. You can set that up in here. We also have things like under level editor viewports. We could change the way the viewport is handled. So one common thing within a program like Maya is you hold down Alt or Option, right? Left click and drag is going to give you the option to pretty much orbit around, or middle mouse click is going to give you options to kind of drag. And if you're trying to do that inside this the Unreal Engine, it might end up feeling reversed depending on how you have it set up. So in the preferences, if you go into invert middle mouse pan, again, this is under your viewport setting and level editor, you can turn that on and it's going to help so that things don't feel like they're inverted for you. That's just one way to make it a little bit more comfortable. If you're familiar with that setup, you can invert the mouse pan. And then down here, we have other options that you can turn on, like enable arc ball rotate and screen rotate, which I'll kind of show you what those are a little bit later on. But that pretty much has to do with how you can rotate your object and having more control over that, which some other programs will offer that by default, but it's not turned on by default in the Unreal Engine. So you can turn those on. There's even stuff for marquee selection, which you can turn on for your left mouse button to select over things. You can search for that and turn those on as well. So that's just what that is. And then in terms of measuring tools, you can set what the measurements are that you want to set up, right? So things like centimeters, meters, kilometers, so on. So these are just a few settings there. You also have specific settings for your project. So if you ever need to turn on, turn off things within your project itself, just the file that you have open, you can do that inside of this panel. And you can search and go into specific areas for that. And finally, plugins. Plugins, this is where you can install additional support plugins, depending on what you have. Maybe you have something like I do, which is like a 3D mouse that you can use, and you have a plugin for that, or something else that's been developed that you want to use. You can search for it in here or add it, turn it on, and oftentimes you do have to restart the engine, so just be aware of that. But that's where you can access this. All right, so we went over those main pieces. Now, in terms of overall view within our window here, now that I've done a few of those adjustments, or you can see that, if I hold down Alt or Option and left click on my mouse, this is going to allow me to now orbit. Middle mouse click while holding down Alt is going to let me do that booming up and down or trucking left and right. And then dolling in and out, if you hold down right click and Alt, will let you do that. So you can have a little bit more familiarity if you're coming from a program like Maya. Additionally, if you want to move around as if you're in a game, in the game kind of navigational mode, if you right click and drag, right, so you're orbiting, you can also use the keyboard shortcuts, W to move forward, S to move backwards, A to go to the left, D to go to the right. And then if you want to boom up or down, we have Q to boom downwards and E to boom upwards. So you can use your keyboard to navigate this way. Now you might find maybe moving around, you're going way too fast. Things are just flying by when you're trying to use that kind of dollying or translating mode. And if that's the case, you do have a camera function up here for camera speed. If you click on that, you'll see it says camera speed and it's set to 1. So you can drag the slider, or if you hold down right click and use your scroll wheel, you'll see you can adjust the numbers there. And this will slow down your movement speed or speed it up if you need to fly through a really large level. So that's how that can be set up. If you ever lose sight of something or you need to reset it, you can select an object, hit F on the keyboard. In this case, I'm going to, in my outliner view, just select in here, I have a floor. I hit F on it and I can focus or frame onto it. So this is another keyboard shortcut that very common across different programs, but good to be aware of using in here. You can change your different views under this little drop down. Right now we're in our perspective view. So if you need to switch between different orientations or orthographic views, we do have things like the top view down, bottom, left, right. And with any of these, you can move in 2-dimensional axes. So I'm right clicking to pretty much translate up and down, scroll wheel to zoom in and out. You have your front view, back views. You can go back to perspective. And there's all these keyboard shortcuts for those different views, should you want to use them. We can also see things built up depending on if there's lighting set up or if we want to do different troubleshooting within the engine within these different views. So right now we're looking at everything lit, but if you wanted to see what everything looks like in wireframe mode and its construction, you do have that option here. We can start to see how everything is built with its mesh and what the triangles look like and so on. So different methods for that, but for now we're going to stay in lit. We can also turn on overlays, different objects under show. So you can check these on and off as needed for specific things that you're working on. When it comes to selecting objects, we do have options here for selection, typical navigation things that you would use in a 3D program. So with your typical 3D program, you do have those different navigation options for selection, translate, rotate, and scale. And you can select each of those by clicking on it or using the typical keyboard shortcuts Q, W, E, and R to cycle between those. You also have an option to change orientation. So if you need to change the way something is oriented, an object, to how everything is in the world space, you have a button for that, which you can toggle on and off between typical translate up, down, left, right, and those numerically being represented in world space, or seeing things that get rotated. For example, if I were to rotate this and I wanted to do this one instead. So I can see how this is showing up and down still within world space. You can toggle this into your object space and you can see our rotation and orientation has changed now. So that's a way that you can toggle between those views right here. We also have methods for moving objects around. So by default, when you open up the program, right, you should have within the blank setup kind of a world that looks like this already and a ground that you can work with. But what we will do is we will add some objects in here in a moment. But for the moment, just so you can see this ground floor, if I were to start moving this as an object, I click and drag, you might see it kind of snaps a bit, right? It pops a tiny bit here. So as I'm doing that, the reason it's snapping is because we have something called grid snapping on here. If you turn that off, you click and drag, there's not going to be any snapping happening. So we have snap options dedicated to translate, rotate, and scale. Right? If I were to rotate this, it snaps at each 10-degree increments. But if I turn that off, we can go in between and have smoother rotations. So whenever you're working with your characters or objects and you want to properly position them exactly how you want to, make sure grid snapping is turned off so you have more control over those kinds of things. And then we have our panel layout. So at the far right, if you want to see different panels within your viewport or multiple viewports, you can do that so we can see our different orthographic views like so. We could change which one we want to have. Instead of right, we can have top, we can have the bottom one. However you want to change these layouts. And you can maximize each of them by clicking like that. Or if you want to go full screen, you can hit F11 on the keyboard. That's going to throw this into full screen for you. And if you want to get back out of this, just hit F11 again, and you'll see the rest of your panels come right back. Let's say you're looking at an object and you want to maintain that position and come back to it real quickly. So if for some reason I really like this perspective, I want to see my scene from this perspective, I want to save this position. Right now I'm using a perspective camera, and we can actually bookmark or save these. So underneath our options here, where you have this 3-bar menu item, if you go down, you'll actually see where it says bookmarks, set bookmark, and you can tell it which number you want to set this to. So I'll throw this on 0, move my camera around, maybe get really close here, go back to bookmarks.
Excuse me.
Set another one.
Noah?
Yes.
We've got a comment coming in that you've got part of your Zoom menu across the top, which for people who are observing this is giving kind of like a series of like a shaded box. Is there any way that you can move that menu off your screen if you have a second screen, or if you can move it down to the bottom? Because much better. Now we can see buttons. Thank you. Sure.
Yeah, I don't know if it was covering all of this?
Some of it, yes.
Okay. All right. Yeah, sorry about that. We'll have to probably drag it back and forth throughout this. Okay. So let's say in here, I want to set this camera view as another bookmark. You can set it, and let's say I put number 1. So now I have 2 bookmarks that are set. And if I press 0 on the keyboard and then 1 on the keyboard, it'll just jump between those bookmarks as needed. You can also go in under your bookmarks, jump to them this way, set more. You can clear specific ones or clear all of them. And now those buttons won't do anything anymore. That's just a quick way to set specific points if you need to just jump to and be able to do that real quickly. All right. So at this point, I'm going to start bringing in objects for you guys, and we'll talk about talk a little bit about the properties of it in just a minute, and then we'll jump into a little break. So at the bottom here, we mentioned earlier when we were looking at the layout that there is this content drawer. At the very bottom, if you click on that, it'll pop this up. And you do have options to dock this into your layout. Otherwise, it'll keep hiding itself automatically. So you can dock this if you want to. It'll stay down here. This is how it typically was in older versions. But you can also completely remove the content browser for your content drawer and just pop it up this way. You can also hit the keyboard shortcut Control Spacebar, and that's going to pop that up for you as well. Now, just to state real quickly, also just going back about cameras here, we will talk about in upcoming lectures about how cameras work and so on. But yes, you are able to actually set your bookmarks and create cameras based off of wherever you are placed at that moment. So there are ways to do that. Now, inside the content browser here, Right now we're looking at all content. You can see at the very top here, that's just showing us the very root of everything. And this may be visible or not visible for you to see engine content. If you want to see engine content, there are options for seeing that. You can turn that on in your settings here to show engine content or not, but that's a way to make that visible. I'm going to go into our content browser here. And this is stuff that you're not going to have by default. All these things, we'll go over that. That's specific for today's lecture. But you will have a starter content folder if you did check off starter content like I mentioned at the very beginning. And in starter content, this is where we can start to find different objects that we'll drag in. So you can see we have different things like architecture or materials, props, shapes, textures, and so on. And each of these has different objects that we can work with. So this is something that we'll dive a little bit more into in just a minute. I do want to talk a bit more about getting into data management before we actually start jumping into all of this kind of setup, what this really does. So at this point, I think it might be a good idea. We can start taking our first break. We're just at about 8:50. And when we come back, we'll talk about data management, getting into how things are set up within that content browser and between different panels. If you're going from something like in Maya or into Unreal, and how a project is really constructed. And at this point, we're going to talk about data management. Again, as I stated earlier, apologies for any sound that may come through in the background. So data management in Unreal. We're going to talk about kind of the differences between simple program, as an example that is, like Maya versus Unreal, one that a lot of you that may already be working in animation are familiar with. And within that, there are some differences in terminology, also some similarities. Within Maya, you'll be familiar with the term scene. So anytime you're dealing with a scene file that you're working within and saving your files in or out to, it's a scene file. But inside of Unreal, we call that a project file. And then file types that are saved out are things like .ma, ASCII or ASCIIs, or MBs or Maya binary files. That's what your project files are saved out in Maya. But in Unreal Engine, you have an actual project file, and any of the assets that you're working with are saved as or converted as .u assets. In Maya, that window that you see everything in is also called the viewport. So it's similar inside of Unreal. We just use it as a viewport. Attribute editor or channel box editor. So in Maya, wherever you see properties, details, things where you can manipulate, translation, rotate, scale, all that kind of stuff, and numerically keyframe that, that's all inside of your attributes or channel box editor. But in Unreal, that's going to be in the details editor. Our outliner is where we see all the things within our scene file in Maya. But in Unreal Engine, inside of our project file or level, we'll be able to see things in our world outliner. We also have a visor or content browser inside of Maya. And just as I briefly showed you, there is that content browser inside of Unreal. When we're animating inside of a program like Maya, oftentimes when we want to get into details of our animation, we use the graph editor. But in Unreal Engine, we'll use the curve editor. In Maya, there are things called the tracks editor, and that's going to let you deal with animation takes and kind of blending or animating those. And inside of Unreal, that's going to be sequencer, a very big tool that you're going to be learning about today. And Hypershade. Hypershade inside of Maya, that's where we have our materials that we can create and set up, shaders and all that, create a whole network to work with for that. And in Unreal, that's the material editor. So that's just a few similarities and differences. A few more terms that will be different going into Unreal are things like static versus skeletal meshes. So what that really means is anything that is not animated, like just an object that's not moving, versus something that can be animated, like a skeletal mesh, that has typically a joint hierarchy built inside of it. things like actors or pawns or characters. These are all different things where when you place any object inside of your scene, it's basically an actor, but you have different ways that they can be handled, and whether there's something that can be possessed or that can be moved around and treated like a character and so on. We also have worlds, maps, and levels. So you can kind of think of it as a hierarchy where you have your overall world that you're working within, you have individual maps or levels, those can be interchangeable typically, in how you work within the program. So those are kind of like your scene files, but they are sub levels, if you will. And we also have level sequences and how those can be interacted with within Sequencer. Control rigs, that's where you can deal with rigging within inside of Unreal. Volumes, so you'll learn more about volumes throughout the fellowship, as well as blueprints for scripting, and things like source control, which are more for data management and for how you end up saving files out when you're working in collaboration with large teams. So one common one is called Perforce, and that's something that you can set up with Unreal to be able to work in large studio type settings typically. Make sure that your files don't get corrupt or overwritten. All right, so data management project hierarchy. So we have Maya and Unreal, and a typical folder structure within Maya is going to have things like assets, and you're going to have autosaves. Assets is typically where you'll have all of your files that you're working with. That could be things like rigs or models and whatever. Your autosave files, temp cache data, and so on. Rendered out images or image sequences or movies. Your scene files are typically where your project files are saved, and you have those individual scenes for shots you'd be working on. And you have your sound or source images, things that are being brought into the program to work with, and a default kind of workspace setup. So that's kind of like Maya's thing, right? But with Unreal, you have different supporting folders as well with the structure, things like binaries and how it gets set up and runs. And you have a build, which is when you build out the project file you're working with for games and so on, it can save data into that. Config is kind of like a Maya preferences folder. It's how you configure everything within the engine for your own preferences. Content is where everything is really the main focus. That's where you're going to store and have all of your assets and files really within there. So you can kind of think of that like assets or scenes combined. Everything's going to be in that contents folder. And then things like derived cache data or intermediate, those are like temporary cache data type things that can sometimes share if you need to load project files faster across different departments or across teams. But typically it's temporary stuff you don't, doesn't always get saved. And then you have plugins. Your plugins are going to be any of those active plugins. If you go to edit plugins inside of the editor, you can turn those on or install plugins into there. And that's where that gets placed. And then saved is like Maya's autosave section. So it's going to automatically save any of your project data in there over periods of time. And then at the very bottom there where you see it says FN launch trailer, for example, that's the Unreal Engine project file. That's the real main project that you're opening and loading up. And any content is getting really pulled from that content folder. So let's take, for example, this asset. We're going to use a different one in today's example, but let's just take this visually for a second here. If you look, you'll see if we were to take this asset, on the left-hand side, we actually do see in the content browser here, your asset that has been browsed to, but also we have a couple fine Windows Explorer windows that have been popped open here to look at the file itself. And you can see on one hand, we have where everything is saved as a .u asset. So it's been converted over once it's been brought into Unreal. On the right-hand side, you see there's an imports folder within our Unreal project. And that's where we have things like an FBX file, where we have maybe the Maya file itself, anything that is like the source, the original source file that's getting imported into the engine and then gets saved into the content folder. So we'll go over that with a real example in a minute too. And then you can see that it's just basically just separate locations, but everything does get converted to a .u asset. All right, we'll come back to project logic in a moment. Let's jump back into the Unreal Engine. All right, so here's the Unreal Engine. And just to kind of show you, there is an asset in this project file, not the brand new one, but if you did download it as a setup, you will see there's a little folder here under content that says chair. If you jump into that, we have a very basic chair that we can click and drag in here. And that's what it looks like. There's no materials on it at the moment. That's just kind of how it sets up. And it should load up with something in a minute, but this is just the object itself. If we were to go between a program like Maya, right, we can see this within the project file inside of Maya, export it out into a file type like an FBX, and that's something you'll learn how to do a little more of throughout the fellowship program. But from here, we can actually import this file. And anytime you import stuff, just so you can see that's going to be one option, you can right click and import it. But that's how this is basically brought in. Now, this is starter content. It was initially saved out, worked within Maya, for an example, and then brought back in as an asset. But if you were to right click on the asset, you can go to where it says show in Explorer. And this is going to pop up a new window, which I will share with you. And you'll see that's where it's browsing us to, right? The chair.asset. So that's inside of our content. Just as you can see, it's reflecting the same structure, right? We're inside the project file, we're inside of content. We have those other subfolders here. You go into chair and there's that U asset. But we also have inside of this, if you go back into the main folder for the project, an imports folder. And within these subfolders, there are things like the FBX, the original file that was imported. Within something like Maya, right? If you were to go to the Maya setup, this might be something that would have been inside of assets, right? Something like that as an FBX. But that can be imported, brought into the program, gets converted into that .u asset that we see here. So that's just how the structure is kind of set up within the Unreal Engine. Let me pop right back into our editor. Okay, we can also mouse over our objects, and we do see all the properties behind it where it is saved. You can see that path is in game and chair. You can see details on the size of it, how many triangles there are. Anything that we need to basically see at a glance can be seen when you mouse over the object. Now that I have the object placed here, again, I stated this is something that did come from our starter content, and I'll kind of just show you how you can link back to it in a second. But just once the object is placed or dragged and placed into our viewport, you do see it shows up in our outliner here. This is our world outliner. And if you don't have these other things, don't worry. If you're not working in our sample project file, you'll see things a little differently. That's fine. But here you can just see SM for skeletal mesh, chair 2 was just brought in. So once this is brought in, you can link up things and modify properties to it. You'll see down in our details panel, we have a location where this is currently placed. If I select our object and bring up the move tool, as I move it around, right, we get property changes for the x-axis, the y-axis, and again, the up z-axis that you see there. You can also reset this if you need to by clicking on that arrow to reset it into its default, the way it was imported. We have things like the static mesh. This is the actual object that's been brought in. So we can see that. We can also choose from other content in here if we need to. And then materials. So there is a material for this chair, and you can also search for it. And that's going to be this first one that pops up. Click on that, and you can link up a material to it. So that's part of the starter content that's in here. So that material, anytime you want to see material properties or work within what's like the Hypershade in Maya, but is the actual material editor, you You can double click on that little box there, that little icon thumbnail. And this is what that editor looks like. This is just a material graph. This is a whole nodal-based system, also similar in terms of it being nodal-based to how the hyper shader or hypergraph works inside of Maya. But this is something you'll get more into within other courses in the program. We're not going to get into how all this works, but that's just how you can pop it open and you can see where that exists. So currently, if I want to browse to where this asset is in the content browser, you can just click on this little icon. It shows a picture of a magnifying glass and a folder. And that's going to pop this open and it's going to navigate you exactly to where this is saved in the content browser or on in the project file hierarchy. You can also change this. So if I go into where static mesh was with my object selected, if I want to change this to the starter content chair, I'll click on that one. It looks the same, right? It's the same object, just brought in differently. And now if I click on this little browse icon, you can see it's navigated me to a completely different location. This is where our starter content actually exists. So again, to just navigate to that, you'd go into content, you go into starter content, props, and you can see there's that chair asset. And that's the exact same thing. We just swapped out which asset we're using with this actor being brought inside of here. I'm going to go ahead and delete that just for a moment. And I'm going to turn on the visibility here of our chair itself. So I have a folder that was for that. It's just the same thing, I'm just making it visible here. All right. So now that's currently visible. And if we wanted to get into talking about like project logic and kind of a little bit more of how things are kind of set up within the engine, we can jump into that right now. And you'll start to get a little bit more of a sense of kind of the hierarchy and how things are built. Before I do that, I do want to show you placement, another option for placement in here. So aside from using just these controls to move everything within our outline or selecting the object and using the move tool, you actually can right click on the object itself or use the keyboard shortcut Control-Shift-P. And this will actually let you take the perspective view of that object, in this case, our chair, and you can pilot this around. You can move it wherever you want to place your object, whatever the angle is, maybe like this is an angle I'm really happy with. And once I'm done positioning it like so, I can eject my camera view using this icon on the left here, little triangle. And now I've placed my object that way. So you can pilot things around that way if you want to for positioning. And if you really want to reset them, you can just reset them there in your transform settings of the details panel. All right, so let's talk a little bit about project logic. Let me switch over our view. All right, so project logic. So a typical...
We're still seeing Unreal, by the way. No.
Oh, how about now?
We're good.
Okay. All right, so project logic. So typically inside a film, you have a structured setup, whether it's physical or you can kind of think of it even as digital inside of a program like Maya, for example, some other DCC. You have whatever that location is, but we're going to currently relate this to practical side of things, things on set. So typical workflow within physical working locations, when you're filming, you have a location. Within that location, you have stage that you're working within or a sound stage. Inside of that stage, you have different set pieces that you're working on or that are built up. And inside our sets, we have props and actors that are being interacted with or acting. We have then the supporting people like crews or objects like lights and cameras and different rigging and practical effects in that case. Within Unreal, there is a similar kind of approach, but things are going to be labeled differently. So our location is our project or our project file, and the stage is going to be our levels. And then any set pieces we're building in there can be thought of as sub-levels, levels within levels, basically. And props and actors are going to be things like our SK or SM or skeletal or static mesh actors. And then we have other supporting things in there, like different components or blueprints or C++ code or control rigging. Instead of rigging, we have control rigs. And instead of practical effects, we have something like Niagara that we can use for simulations. There's also things like scene assemblies, so assembled environments that are constructed from different DCCs, so something that you would bring in maybe from a program like Maya. You have performance takes, and that's going to be different things like your raw animated mocap data or something that was animated in Origin to some form. It could also be keyframed. We have master layouts. So these are your graduated takes that are assembled to block out your character performance, and then overall shots that are basically graduated master layout shots combined with cameras to film that action. And then overall, master sequences. So a series of different shots that represent a portion of that film. So talking about that aspect of world and levels and sublevels, we do have what is always ongoing, which is a persistent level. And so I'll go over this part of this in the editor in a moment. We'll just go over a few of these slides first. But basically, you have your persistent level that you work within, and you can create sublevels to deal with environments or specific things like lighting or camera setups that you want to use or characters, anything that's like a custom blueprint, effects, or things for post-processing, which we'll learn more about post-processing down the line. But these are different setups that you can use as like those separate, if you will, sound stages or stages that you would work within the actual location. We then have things like the sequencer. And so you're going to learn a lot more about this coming up. But just to give you a preview, one big powerful thing within Unreal is the sequence editor or sequencer. Again, this takes something like an editorial program that you'd be working with, or even something like the tracks editor inside of Maya, and just takes it a lot further and allows you to do everything in real time. So you can literally add in characters, actors, like objects. You can use this to deal with, overall shot creation with cameras, but also you can previs things out. You can use things for lights in here. Allows you to do just full on editorial approach, but in a 3D sense. So that's what this is really meant and used for. There's more documentation on it here. And again, you'll learn more in upcoming lectures about it. And then furthermore, within it, we do have our curve editor. And so that's what your curve editor basically looks like. And so it lets you pop it open, modify different objects, and see how you would animate it, kind of like the graph editor, but even more functionality than that in some of the other programs. You can use it inside of Unreal. So it can be compatible with the level editor, take editor, your cinematic assets, blueprints in Niagara, the control rig options that you'd be working with for rigging characters or animating them, and composure. And furthermore, whether or not you're working between the sequencer or different blueprints and whatnot, there are things that are important to be aware of, which is the terminology called possessable versus spawnable. And so basically possessables are anything that's intended to be a level actor that is possessed by each level sequence that calls them into use. So anything that you would place into that level that sits in there, that's like a possessable object or character or actor. And then you have spawnables, and those are things that only exist within unique level sequences when it's called up to be used, and it will exist and then disappear when the level sequence is not being used or a blueprint isn't accessing it. And typically you'll see that little icon of a lightning bolt that'll show up to kind of represent that that's something that was spawned. So those are a couple things to be aware of within the setup. So now I'm just going to kind of show you a little bit of what this kind of looks like and transitioning from one program to another. Let me just pause my share for a second here. Okay, so real quickly, this is just showing you inside of a program like Maya, right, where you have similar types of panels, things like an outliner, things like a graph editor or attribute editor, timeline, and all that kind of stuff, something you might already be familiar with. This was just that simple object, right, that was exported, brought in as an FBX between the different programs. But you can also get things like animation. And so if you have something, for example, like a skeletal mesh that has mocap data on it, and you play through it, right? Let's say this is just the mocap data that's working on a skeletal mesh. This is something that can be brought into Maya, whether it's from Unreal or directly into Unreal, whether it's coming from Maya into Unreal or just brought in separately from a different program. But this has data that's all saved onto it and baked out. And so we can actually bring this kind of stuff into Unreal. So let me just switch back into Unreal. And so here you can see we have everything very nicely real-time rendered for us with our materials on it. But we're going to start activating and turning on some different properties in here. Now, again, for those of you that just created everything with the starter content from the beginning, that's fine. These are things that you can use from the provided file on Smashcut, but again, not necessary. It's just more important you kind of get the overall sense of what it is that we're doing inside the program and kind of the layout. So if I want to start to see how a level can be constructed or built out with sublevels, we can go into Window and bring up Levels. And by default, it'll probably pop up as its own separate window if you don't have it already as its own property. And here you can see we have a couple levels that were created. I just labeled them, one for light or LGT, one for characters or CHAR. And we have our overall persistent level. So again, you can think about the persistent level as our location, and then any of those different types of sound stages or stages that we'd be working with could be these different supporting things like characters or lights or camera rigs and so on. And these are their own individual levels. And before I start turning any of this on and looking at it, I'm just going to drag my panel over here to position it. And I'm going to look in the content browser so you can see where this exists. So in our little content drawer or browser, whichever you want to use, you'll end up seeing that under content here, we have these different setups. One is going to be called main, and that's going to be our main persistent level that I have loaded up and opened. You'll see I have a little asterisk or star that's showing up on that. This means that the file has not been saved. So if I want to save this specific item, I can select it. You can go File and click Save Current Level or Save the Selected. And if you want to save everything, a whole bunch of objects, any modifications you've made to a specific asset or a material that's not been saved, you can go and say File and Save All or Control-Shift-S. So currently, if I just hit Control-S, it just saved this file. It has now made sure this level has been saved, but something else that's been modified, if I have another star on something else, that's not going to get saved. Not until I do File and Save All or Control-Shift-S. So it's an important thing to be aware of because you might be working on something for a while. It has a star on it. You've messed with an asset or you animated something or worked in Sequencer, and then it doesn't get saved. And it'll usually ask you to save something before you close or switch between levels. And of course, there is an autosave as well. But it's important to be aware if you want to make these changes and commit to them, that you do apply those changes either to the specific one or to everything. So here I have a sublevel that's called LGT. If I double click on that, you can see it just loaded a light setup in here. And I'm not seeing anything because this is turned off. But basically, there is a blue light that was just placed in here. And so that exists right now within this sub-level. That's the only thing I have in here. Maybe I just want to have a lighting setup that can be accessed and turned on and off. You can place that within a sub-level like this. And then if I went into character here, really difficult to see, it's dark at the moment, but we do have a couple characters here from our Maya file that were brought in. And this is its persistent level. So these are separate setups dedicated to just the characters or just the lighting. And if I go back to main, you go back here to lit, I can start turning on these sub levels to view them. I'm going to take this off here just so you can see what happens in our outliner as I do this. So if I turn on light, look at that. You can see our chair has been placed here. I'm actually going to move it like this for a second. You can see that a little bit better. So our light is now active. This light setup from this level is coming across. And every time I enable or disable, so I'm just taking this off the side here so that you can see under LGT or light, if you turn this on or off to activate this level, the sub level, it does populate or spawn that light for us to be visible inside of our overall persistent level. And this is something that if you're not really seeing by default, you can right click on it and change it from its streaming method to be always loaded. So that's a way you can turn it to, instead of be reliant upon a blueprint, it is always going to be loaded. So right click, change the streaming method, and you go into always loaded. These are currently locked so that modifications can't be made to them, but you can unlock them, and then you would be able to see that be accessible here. So you can lock your levels once you've modified them. We also have character, right? So if I turn on character, now I can see these two instances of characters. One has been brought in to be used as just a game animation, for example, that once you run the game view, you're going to see it animate right away from the start. Another one's been brought in to be used for shots, something like Sequencer would use. Again, as I stated earlier, changing the visibility here is going to change once you see them populated into your scene. You can also organize different assets with folders. You can do that by right-clicking and clicking Create Folder. And if there's something you wanted to move, let's say I want to move one of these, you can right-click, go down to Move To, and pick a folder or location that I might want to change this or place it in. Maybe I put this in Environment. Or maybe I put it back into Light. So you can do it that way. You can also click and drag to reposition and place things in the subfolders as well for organization. If you want to relabel something, there's a keyboard shortcut, which is F2. You can also right-click, go to Edit, and Rename. If you want to make copies, you can duplicate using Control-D and so on. So that's just a little bit of the organizational part of our outliner here and turning these on and off. Let me drop that back here inside of our level view. And I do want you to be able to see kind of what happens here with these two characters. Another thing about the viewport. In the viewport right now, we're seeing are commonly referred to as like kind of gizmos that are visible in your overlay, but you can hide them by going into game mode by hitting G on the keyboard. So we're not seeing specific properties for the light or what is here our player start position. So if you were treating this as a game, this is the player start position. You can hide those by hitting G, and you can actually start to see what things would look like rendered in real time without all that overlaid. But we can also enter into our gameplay mode, hitting this little play view to play this level. And the keyboard shortcut's Alt-P. So I hit Alt-P. We're now going to see that animation is here. We can look at it, move our character around, holding the right mouse button, and you can use W to move forward, S to go back, left and right is A and D, and so on. So we can look at the entire scene. So our character here is just playing, looping through its animation cycle. And that's just the way the character was brought in. But we also have our other character here, and this one is being brought in, and we can apply animation to it using Sequencer, and that's a different setup completely. So I'm hitting either the stop or escape button to get out of that. And if we want to start to see how this gets set up, let's first look at where everything is saved, just so you have a sense of that. So I'll go ahead and select our character. This is currently locked, so let me just unlock it so I can select it. And once we have it selected, I can now go into our details here. So again, if you do lock your levels, for example, like so, oops, wrong one. You can't select and modify anything. You have to unlock that level. So once it's selected, maybe I want to navigate to where this asset exists in our content browser. Again, you can click on this. You can also right click and go to browse to asset or hit Control B. And that's going to show me where this is currently saved. So content, I have a folder called Manny, and this is just brought in FBX with animation, and then here's a little sequencer that you can use for the animation. So that's just where this exists, but the actual asset itself does exist inside of our content if you do download the rig and have it set up. And that's something that you'd be able to find inside of your different characters, setups, and so on. So you can go inside of content for that and have this animated character be installed as well, and then get access to those materials if you want to. So, all right, going back into folder here, you'll see we have access to different parts like the skeletal mesh. I'm just going to show you if you double click on that. This does bring up the editor where you can see the asset itself. You can see specific properties to it, like how its joint hierarchy was set up, or any animations that are associated with it. All this kind of stuff will be gotten into or described more in detail coming up. And then for the actual sequencer, right, if we go back and bring up this little sequence, this is something that can be created in your menus. It'll bring up a window called Sequencer. And just like you saw inside of the PowerPoint presentation, you do have this kind of window. You can have clips that are in here. You can have raw animation that's in here with hand-keyed individual keyframes. The second I brought this open, you could see we have our character that was in here and also a chair that's in here that has some animation. And it's just very rough, quick, basic animation that if you hit spacebar, you'll be able to see that now taking place as an action. And this is the area where you'll end up spending a lot of your time within Sequencer for basic animations and detailed animations. And to get more into your detailed animation, you have that curve editor, which we talked about more extensively, where you can see specific curves and be able to modify these keyframes for animation. So that's kind of how this works in hand with different setups, different characters or objects inside of the Unreal Engine. And all that you'll get into more in detail. Another note about the actual setup here for your different levels. In your level view, you can change the context view down here. So if you wanted to edit specifically character objects and deal with character related things, you can modify it in that context for that level without having to fully enter into that level, as well as things like LGT, which is locked right now. And you can see because it's locked, and get this error message. So that's just how you can switch between those and the context of them as you're working within the engine. I'll go ahead and lock that again. And that's basically how that sets up. Now let's talk a little bit more about some best practices and kind of how you should kind of approach things inside of Unreal. Let me switch my view here. So hopefully you're all seeing the PowerPoint at this point. So best practices. So for best practices, it's a good idea to focus on how you name things, what the naming convention is. And this is great across any files you're working with, but especially when you're working within CG animation. There's so much that can be technically set up in terms of coding and scripting, and it's really important that you follow certain naming conventions so that things don't break. Your plugins won't break, your additional supporting scripting or coding doesn't break and have trouble accessing an asset or command. So it really does become important to make sure you follow a lot of these types of things when it comes to naming conventions. So things like Pascal case, that's where you capitalize every word and you remove any spaces. Spaces are things that you want to avoid. So for example, something like the word Desert Eagle or an asset that would be Desert Eagle or style guide, or just a series of words, you can capitalize each word, and that's how you would label it. Another is something called camel or humpback casing, and that's where you make the very first letter lowercase, and it's always lowercase, and any preceding word is capitalized. So that's what that would be. So like Desert Eagle, style guide, a series of words, always the first letter of the first word is lowercase. Another is something called snake case, and that's making sure you have an underscore instead of a space. And so you can have things start with uppercase or lowercase, but generally speaking, it's always going to have an underscore instead of a space. So you never want to use any of these things unless you're absolutely required to or it's necessary. So always try to avoid empty white space of any kind, any backward slashes, any symbols like the pound or number hashtag sign or tilde or certain quotes, marks, @ sign, $sign, any of that kind of stuff. Any Unicode character, any of those things you want to try to avoid. And you do want to try to stick to any of the following, basically any typical alphabetical character A through Z, capitalized or lowercase, any numbers 0, 1 through 9. And then sparingly, you do want to sparingly use those underscores, but you can. So this, again, ensures the greatest compatibility across all platforms. There are other ways to obviously label and group and organize things based off of an asset type, or if it's like a level versus a skeletal mesh, or if it's a prop versus a character. And you can label those things too and give those their own abbreviation as well. So as much as you can stay organized, the better. And there are different ways of doing that in the content browser too, which we'll talk a little bit about in a moment. But you can also follow this overall Aller style guide and go to that link for more information. And then we should be breaking down environments into manageable separate levels. So kind of like that sub-level aspect we talked about, you can place all commonly shared things, global actors into that persistent level, things like a sun or sky dome, certain lights that might always exist, but you could also place those into their own separate level, depending on if you want a light setup for that. You also want to divide your action into beats with specific scenes and create separate levels for each of those. So you can have a separate level that is basically going to help because it's going to bring everything back to the origin or back to the values of 0, 0, 0. So it helps to avoid what are called floating point numerical errors when you're trying to deal with multiple assets and when environments and things get too big. So it's good to just work within these sub levels or different levels. And you can also, it also decrease large values set inside of the details panel because things are not placed closer to the origin. You can also refine levels again with sublevels for organization. Just try to resist having too many of them as sublevels that are active and ongoing. So too many can be hard to manage. So again, certain things like maybe a light setup, maybe certain props or characters or aspects that would be used and accessed from time to time. That's a way to kind of break it up. And then again, level visibility, like we talked about, there's different tools and ways that you can turn those on and off and have it be visible. And you want to keep that streaming method to always loaded instead of it being always called upon by a blueprint, unless you really need it for that reason. And make sure you label folders within the, the content browser or inside of your outliner as well. So you can just really keep things organized in that structure. Now, we did talk about spawnable, possessables, and so on. Those are other things that can be very helpful for best practices. Spawnables are good for temporary actors that would maybe be in the background or that would come up. They're good for shot-specific lighting setups and modifications. They're great for, making parenting situations. They can make parenting situations difficult, but you need like attached tracks to help with that. So that's another thing that can be an issue, but they do reduce the memory overhead when they're not in use. So you're really only calling them when you need to, and that's going to use system memory at that time, and then they basically don't spawn anymore, they disappear or they die off, and then you have more memory available on the computer. And possessables are better for fixed assets that are regularly used within all your shots. They're not destroyed after the shot is completed like spawnables. All right, and then we have our ways of organizing and cleaning things up. So how you would fix up things like your files if they get reorganized, or how to transfer from one project file to another, or how to check what is being used, like which assets are being used and where, and information about that. So let's just pop back into our editor. Hold for just a second here. All right, so now we're back in Unreal and we're inside that content drawer. So in the content drawer here, or browser, you can actually see all of our assets again, right? So with these different assets, if you wanted to try and filter out your view, first of all, you have a little filter menu. You can isolate this to just view level objects only. You can add other objects to this, like maybe skeletal meshes that you want to see, or materials. So you can isolate that and turn these on and off for these filters as needed to browse between your different assets in here. You also can clear all of these if you need to reset them. So you don't have to commit to that. And you can search inside here for something specific, like Manny. And you'll get all those different ones within the starter content and so on. So that's just a way to search and filter things out. But in terms of trying to stay a little bit more organized, if you wanted to check that things are connecting properly, you can always select whichever assets may have been modified or relocated, renamed. You can select them, right-click on them, and go down to where it says Fix Redirectories. Basically, redirectories, they're like different types of references that is being connected from this link that we see inside the browser to where that asset actually exists or used to exist. And anytime we start modifying and moving any of these assets from one folder to another, or duplicating or renaming it, you might have some aspect of a level or a sequencer or blueprint that is referencing the old name or position of where that was. And once you start to relocate it, it starts to tell it through a redirector where that currently exists versus where it used to exist. So to help clean all that up, we can get rid of these redirectors and have it properly connect to the new location. And so you can do that by saying Fix Redirectories, and that might take a second depending on if you have any issues that need fixing, and it will clear that up and make sure that any folders that you were trying to eliminate or get rid of should be now clear of any redirectors, and you could then delete folders that are maybe stubborn and won't get deleted because of that. So that's one thing to be aware of. Another is, let's say you're trying to look at information specific to our objects, maybe specifically any assets inside of here where it says chair. I can right click, go to audit assets, and you can see I just have this one asset that popped up. Let me make this a little bit smaller. We have one asset that popped up, which is that skeletal mesh chair, and it tells you information about it specifically. But if you want to look at a bunch of them, you can go into something like starter content, select individual ones. And if you do audit assets, you'll see a bunch of different ones that you can organize by name or the type and so on to really see what information there is for those objects or those assets. So this is just a way to view that in detail. And then furthermore, let's say you want specific objects from your project file into another project file. Maybe you just want to work on setting up a certain scene and you like the way one thing was working in one project and you're creating a new one and you don't know how to combine everything. You could start copying things over from your Finder window, going through the system itself, the system browser, but that's going to become problematic at times because you might have issues with redirectors or things linking up or things getting corrupted and not staying. It is proper to do a migrate or a migration. So if you have specific content that you want to transfer, like let's say these few, you can right click, go to migrate. It'll tell you first you might need to save something. So I'm going to save my level. And then here I can select specifically which folders, which assets I do want to migrate over into another project file. So I'll click OK. And if I had a project folder that was set up, I would just go to the content folder of that project file, click select folder, and it will transfer all those files for me without a problem. And then finally, you'd be able to go into that project that you've just transferred your files into. You can go File, open up Project, or even make a new one if you have to. Earlier on, you can make a new one and then do the migration. And then you'll be able to see them existing inside of that new project. You'll see those assets will be placed there. You can also take your project file and zip it. So if you want to be able to transfer or share your project files, you can very easily just go File, Zip Project File. It'll zip it up into a containing file that is going to have the entire folder structure with your project, and that makes it easy to share, easy to transfer across different devices. So that's a little bit about data management, keeping things organized, and being able to see all of that in here. So let me just switch my view. All right, so that's just, again, assets, cleaning them up, redirectors, and so on. So for additional resources, you can go and check out these different document links to help you with support. Of course, always checking out the Unreal website and user manuals and things are always going to be a big help.